This is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the ASUS ROG MAXIMUS Z690 FORMULA. This is an Intel motherboard for Intel's 12th gen CPU setup, and this is an unboxing and review video to talk to you about what this motherboard's like, what's included in the box, the features and specs of it, the highlights, and the things that make it interesting. I purchased this motherboard as an upgrade to my previous 11th gen system, and to show it off in the Fractal Design torrent case that I recently built in. And in this video I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with it and point out the various things of interest, as well as the highlights and lowlights of the motherboard as it would go along with installation and use of it, including problems that I've encountered in my setup, so the way I've installed it and what gear I've used. There are some really interesting things about it though, including this Hyper X16 M2 card, which can take up to 2 NVMe SSDs and potentially run one of them at PCIe Gen 5 with X4 speed, so it's future-proof in a way as well, which is pretty nifty. This is a really nice looking motherboard, the main highlight of which is obviously the visual appeal of the white finish with very solid back and front plates on it, as well as EK's cross-chill setup, so you can use a full liquid cooling system in place with the VRM headers on this one as well. As you'd expect, you get a lot of different things in the box included along with the motherboard, including a variety of cables that I'll go into a bit more depth on in a minute. But obviously the main draw of focus here is just the motherboard itself, which is very easy on the eye, and I will be honest, that is one of the reasons I wanted it, because I thought it would look fantastic in the case I was planning on building on. And it's also obviously a very capable motherboard with some very good specs that make it a beast in terms of what you can do with it and the potential power delivery of it. I've already done a video separately on this motherboard in a way with the Noctua Chromax cooler and with Fractal Design torrent case, so if you want to see more, be sure to check out those videos. But in this one I'm going to just talk to you about the various other things going on in here. Now obviously you have SATA data connection cables in here for SSDs and NVMe's. You also have some RGB extension cables, so if you're planning on having RGB lighting in the case and you need some leads to extend the reach of those, there are multiple different headers on the motherboard for controlling the RGB, obviously with RAW sync capable as well, and there's some RGB highlights on the motherboard itself as well. It also has a bracket for your GPU, so if you're fortunate enough to have a case that it'll work in, you can potentially mount that for support purposes. It's an anti-sag bracket that will obviously reduce problems there. There's multiple different data connections for hard disk drives and SSDs, so you have the possibility of connecting multiple. And in the build that I did, I installed a few different drives. The main focus is NVMe SSDs. You'll also find that there's this cool little adapter which ASUS regularly has, which is very handy for plugging in front panel connections. And then there are a multitude of little M2 screws and standoff screws, and I'll show you how we use those in a little while, because you can mount 3 NVMe SSDs directly onto the motherboard, and then 2 in the X16 Hyper PCIe card as well, so you have the potential for up to 5 M2 NVMe drives, some running at Gen 4 speeds, some at Gen 5, and some only at Gen 3, so there are some considerations in what you're installing and how fast it will run, so that's worth bearing in mind. It's also worth checking out the specs that I will have in the description and a link to the official page where it goes into a lot more detail. You also get an antenna for your Wi-Fi, so you can connect that up at the back, and that is Wi-Fi 6E, so you do have some good Wi-Fi potential there, assuming you have a good modem at home in order to handle it. It also has a 10 Gigabyte Ethernet port as well. I was actually surprised it only has 1 Ethernet port on it, considering that the previous Strix motherboard that I looked at actually has 2, and this one is more expensive, but you are paying a premium for what is essentially a very nice setup. Now you will note there are several points on here. You'll notice, for example, the ROG I and also the ROG lettering on the left hand side, and on the top NVMe SSD port there's also an LCD display which is able to show off a number of different things that make it interesting. That will let you know, for example, the current temperatures and other things that your machine's running at. It can also show you problems with booting and give you warnings, and that can also have various different settings in terms of custom displays. And I'll show you that in the Armoury Crate software. Unfortunately, I can't show any clips of it because it's blocked by my CPU cooler, and that's because I'm using a massive Noctua one that I'll show you in a little while. It does have some very nice accents and highlights to it though. You'll note as well there are two large front panel USB-A connections, 6 data ports for your SSDs and hard disk drives here, plenty of connection options there. And one point of curiosity is next to the 24-pin motherboard power supply connection, you also have a 6-pin, which I'll talk about in a bit more depth. So there's a lot of power connections here, a lot of potential connectivity. Having 2 front panel USB connections is particularly useful depending on the case you're using. You might not use them, or you might need them depending on how many front panel connections you've got, but it's nice to have access to all those different things. Another thing of appeal obviously is the rear panel I/O. You can see just how many connections you have here. Multiple USB-C connections, Thunderbolt and fast USB-A connections, as well as the Wi-Fi 6. It also has an integrated ESS DAC for high quality high-res audio, so you have good options there in terms of the audio connectivity. As I said earlier in the video, you also have multiple RGB connections as well, so you can connect up various RGB fans and other devices should you so wish, and it's really easy to do. There are multiple points on here, as well as 2 USB headers as well, so you have plenty of connection options and various places. And you also have a mass of chassis system fan headers, CPU and CPU optional extras, as well as PWM controllable fan headers too. So there's lots going on here, as you can see. Very flexible motherboard. Now, one of the most interesting things about it, and a nice inclusion, is this Hyper M2 card, which essentially allows you to run NVMe SSDs inside it. Now, this supports 2 NVMe SSDs. You can either run just one with potential for support up to PCIe 5 at 4x mode, or you can place 2 in there and have 2 PCIe Gen 4 cards running at 4x. And what you'll find is that you install this in the bottom X16 slot on the motherboard to get the maximum speed out of that. And so you have the top 2 X16 PCIe slots. Those are PCIe Gen 5 compatible at X16, and then the bottom one is PCIe Gen 4 X16, but that can run these 2 NVMe SSDs in here at potentially Gen 4. So you can have 5 drives total, although they won't all run at Gen 4 speed. It is worth noting that there is one on the motherboard that will only support Gen 3. Still, that's potential for a lot of different drives, potentially running at up to 7,000 megabytes per second for PCIe Gen 4, and then obviously once you have more Gen 5 capabilities, there'll be a lot faster speed to come as well. So there's loads of storage options, both in terms of hard disk drives, SSDs, and also NVMe SSDs as well. So in my setup, I currently have a NVMe SSD for Windows, a different one for my games, another one for storing and editing videos on, just to make sure everything's really swift. And the setup I've found actually has been very, very good with this. I'm running an Intel Core i9-12900K, 32 gigabytes of Kingston Fury Beast RAM, and I'll leave all the specs in the description, but the results of it have been very impressive. I've seen a much better performance than I did on the 11th gen setup that I had previously. Rendering videos and such is a lot faster, and obviously with Wi-Fi 6E and the 10 gigabyte Ethernet port, also upload speeds are fantastic as well, depending on your ISP and your provider. But so, as I was saying earlier on, you'll note that this top slot for your NVMe SSD also has a display on the front. More on that in a minute. But you can also install SSDs in here with ease. There's no screw required, as you might find on other motherboards. They're held in place with a clip, so it's really easy to just slip them in and move that clip over the top. And that is a very nice addition to ASUS's current motherboard setup. It makes life a lot easier. Now, that little display that now covers the NVMe that I've installed, is able to show off various different stats and specs, adjustable and demonstratable with an armory crate, so I'll show you that a bit later on. Unfortunately completely hidden by my CPU cooler, which I'll also show you, which is a shame, so I can't really demonstrate it. At the bottom of the motherboard, underneath this other heatsink, you'll see there are 2 potential spots for your M2 drives. Again, one of these only runs at PCIe Gen 3, so it is worth bearing that in mind. Making sure you're choosing the right one. If you have Gen 4 drives, you will find that obviously one of them won't run at the speed it should. At the top, we have other points of interest. For example, obviously this is an LGA 1700 socket motherboard. However, what you will note is that the 4 corners surrounding it, it has 2 holes that are capable of holding onto older generation of CPU coolers, so you can actually use the previous bracket from a 1200 Intel LGA 1200 bracket, and you can use that in place of those instead. So that's a great option for easy installation and potentially reusing CPU coolers that you already have to hand. This motherboard takes up to 4 sticks of DDR5 RAM, and currently that spec includes up to 4 sticks, 128 gigabytes, up to 6400 megahertz. So very nifty and very swift. And as I said, my experience with it has been great. I have used 2 different sorts of RAM in here, but I'm sticking with the Kingston Fury Beast for the moment because it's not only good looking, but it's also the fastest that I have access to currently. Now, the motherboard itself obviously has that shielding both front and back, which gives a nice bit of protection during the installation process. It'll obviously help dissipate heat as well, and it looks the business. Also, as you see, I'm just giving a demonstration again of the installation of the bracket here. This is actually LGA 1700 bracket from Noctua, but a really simple, straightforward installation process. And thanks to those additional holes, it's easy to use other brackets if you can't get access to the compatible tools that often a lot of the manufacturers are selling or giving away as an additional thing if you've already purchased the CPU cooler and you now need a compatibility tool to be able to fix it up. Now, you will note, as I said, there are multiple points here for RGB. The ROG lettering on the top left, the ROG logo on the bottom right, and obviously the LCD display over the NVMe SSD, all are capable of having RGB lighting on them. Aurora capable as well, so you will get some synced lighting with other compatible devices, whether that's fans or RGB strips, and you can sync all that up. There's a lot of plastic to remove, and it is a fiddle to get off of that plastic peel, so this wasn't an ideal thing. Another thing that I haven't mentioned, which I did show off in the previous Strix motherboard, is that these motherboards also have a button for just simply pressing and removing the graphics card with ease. So the top X16 slot has a little button that you can press. That you just press that down and it unlatches the latch that holds the X16 in place, which makes it really straightforward to just take graphics cards in and out if it's something you're going to be doing regularly, which is obviously ideal for me, but not so much for everyone else. Another thing that I mentioned earlier on is that this motherboard has multiple different PWM control headers on it, including 2 CPU fan headers at the top. So in this case, I'm using Noctua Chromax Black CPU cooler, and that I've used a splitter cable to connect up the one single CPU fan header, but you could use CPU fan and CPU optional. Now, in terms of the power connections, this one requires a lot more than normal. Obviously, you have your 24-pin motherboard control power on the right hand side. You also have 2 8-pin power connections at the top left. But one of the things that's fairly unusual about this motherboard is it also requires another 6-pin power connection just underneath the 24-pin connection there. So you will need to make sure you have all the cables in place to do that. Obviously, this draws more power potentially for overclocking and such, and also ensures you're getting all the power you need for DDR5 RAM and everything else that's connected up. So you do have obviously a lot of capabilities here, and that's one of the things about it. There's a lot of different features in terms of AI overclocking and intelligent solutions. So there's AI overclocking, AI cooling, AI networking, and 2-way AI noise cancellation, all available via Armory Crate and customized within the hardware and software of this thing, so you can actually use it and run it efficiently. One of the things that I found with the previous Strix motherboard is that AI overclocking can be a bit hit and miss though, so it's really going to be worth testing, because I found that, for example, 12900K runs far too hot and the overclocking makes it worse rather than better, and I had to undervolt the CPU. I've done a video separately on this if you're interested. But here you can see the final stages of the installation of things like the Hyper M2 card, and obviously 2 drives in there, maximum potential drive, rather than focusing on speed for me because I need multiple drives for multiple different things. But it's a very nice looking card. However, depending on your case, it may be problematic because it does need to be installed in the bottom slot in order to function at maximum speed and to make use of both NVMe drives that are in there. In the fractal design torrent, it's not a problem because there's plenty of room there, and also obviously ideally I have large fans sucking cold air from underside the case and blowing directly onto that and onto the GPU as well. Still plenty of space between the M2 card and the GPU as well. Now I'm going to go into the Armoury Crate software and talk a bit about that. So here we are within Armoury Crate, and on the dashboard you can see the specs of the machine, what's currently running, the various different things including your CPU frequency, current temperature readings, the usage of what things are under. The fan load, it's worth noting that everything's running through a PWM controller with the exception of the CPU fan. That's why there's only one fan showing up here, and other things. But what you'll see on the side here is you have access to be able to access AI overclocking, so you can get this directly from Windows with just a single click rather than having to go into the BIOS, although you can adjust things in the BIOS settings, and AI cooling as well, so you can turn that on and off, and you can set it to adjust between silent, standard, turbo and full speed. Your Aurora Sync lighting obviously changes your RGB lighting both on the motherboard and surrounding peripherals that are connected. For example, I have one RGB strip on the case on the fractal torrent which responds when you click through those lighting options. In here you also have access to the OLED display. So this is the little display over the M2 drive, and you see that you can choose from a number of different things, which unfortunately I can't show you because it's just completely hidden by my CPU cooler. I think that's worth bearing in mind. If you're going for a massive air cooler, you will potentially block that. So perhaps a liquid cooling system might be preferable if you want to make the most of this. But you can see that as well as those options, you can also go into this section, and then you can choose from a number of different animations. So you could have, for example, Formula logo, or just some little dudes lighting up the various space, a shark for some reason, and various different other animations, even a little elephant. I don't know why that's a thing, but there you are, various different choices. You can also have a custom banner, so you could set your own banner or your own text. Unfortunately, as I said, I can't show you any of this. You can go through other various things. You can see what your addressable headers are and what's connected to them, and you get some more information about the RGB headers. If you click into audio, you'll see you have AI noise cancellation options here, which I am not using because I'm using a USB headset. And you also have disk info, so you can see what disks are connected. This is handy because it also shows you the transfer speed, so you'll see that this drive, for example, is running at PCIe Gen 3 X4, and PCIe Gen 4 X4 is another option. And if you go through these, you'll see, so read and write speeds basically on here, and you'll see which ones are running at Gen 4 X4, which is obviously the important part. This Sabrent drive is a Gen 3 drive, so it's not a problem that it's running Gen 3 X4, but it does mean I'm not making the most of that potential connection there. You also have the Fan Expert, which is where you can go in and you can adjust the fan curve if you want, and also obviously you have other options including Hydra Node. So if you have compatible ASUS Hydra Node fans, then you can potentially do it here, but you can see the setup for things like that in there. Aurora Sync is another thing. And then one thing that's handy is you can obviously jump into the tools section and you can see if there's any BIOS updates, which there aren't currently. You can get drivers of various things. And if you go into the settings section, you'll find there are also updates in here very regularly. They keep dropping updates quite often, and just a couple of days ago there was one for the addressable RGB strip, for example. So it's worth regularly checking in Armoury Crate for things like this, and see quite a few different options in here for adjusting things in terms of overclocking and fan speed. Lots of control easily at your fingertips. This has been the Provoked Prawn. I hope you found this video useful. Be sure to check out the links in the description to the other videos, including those on the fractal design torrent, how to undervolt the CPU, and the CPU cooler I used in this video. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.